Today at the National Press Club, Sam Mostyn, the chair of the Women's Economic Equality Task Force, who's held executive and governance roles across business, sport, climate change and the arts sectors. She'll be speaking about the courage to create an economy for all. Sam Mostyn with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. I'd invite you to cast your minds back to September last year and the federal government's Jobs and Skills Summit. The idea for the summit and the summit itself were met with considerable political scepticism at the time, including by opposition leader Peter Dutton, who declined to attend. But the summit ultimately got good reviews. Sure, there was a series of announcements from the government which probably would have been made anyway, about more funding for skills, increased migration and housing. But it was in the optics of actually having the meeting at all that the government seemed to score the best. It helped lock in the perception that there was indeed a change of culture taking place in Canberra with a new government, a government that wanted to consult. And there was lots of commentary on the conspicuous presence and contribution of women at the summit, in sharp contrast to earlier events dominated by men in suits. One of the outcomes of the summit was the establishment of the Women's Economic Equality Task Force to advise the government on how to deliver on its election commitments to prioritise not just issues around gender equality, but driving women's economic equality as an economic imperative. The chair of the task force is our guest today. Please welcome Sam Mostyn to address us.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us here today at the Press Club. Of course, I would like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I accept the invitation to walk with First Nations in seeking a voice to Parliament enshrined in our Constitution, and am grateful for the tireless advocacy and generosity of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders who in 2017 first extended this offer to all Australians, to us as citizens, with the Uluru Statement from the Heart. In a week celebrating International Women's Day, I particularly want to acknowledge the co-chairs of the Uluru Dialogue, Alawaya woman Pat Anderson AO, Cobble Cobble woman Professor Megan Davis, and Uluru Dialogue member and Pitjantjatjara woman Sally Scales, and the many First Nations women whose work continues to guide us. I noticed last night that the Future Women Conference gave the panel over to a First Nations group of wonderful women led by Larissa Barrett, who I also acknowledge. It's also wonderful to have here a number of members of Parliament. I'm really delighted to see Helen Haynes, the Minister for Indi, Zali Steggall, the Minister for Warringah, and Zoe Daniel, the member for Goldstein. I'm delighted, though, that Therese Edwards, the CEO of the National Council of Single Mothers and Their Children, is one of my fellow members on the Women's Economic Equality Task Force, is able to be with us here today. She is a fearless advocate for single mothers and their children across this country. And thank you to so many of you who did travel to Canberra today at very short notice, including some very dear friends, and my husband, Simeon Beckett SC, who lives the principles of equality and respect for women every day. And in our 25 years together, he has supported all the opportunities I've had with such wonderful grace, fully sharing the raising of our beautiful 23-year-old daughter Lottie, who I'm so pleased is watching right now from Melbourne. She's down there in Melbourne alongside a generation that now represent for me the touchstone for why we strive for equality and decency for all. They really are quite a remarkable, exceptional generation. Having grown up amongst the huge dislocation of COVID, they've experienced the toughest of economic challenges, cost of living pressures, mental health stresses, and of course, they know all about the impacts of climate change. And yet, there they are, most often our teachers. They alert us to the concerning impacts of outdated gendered norms and on the need for inclusion for gender non-conforming people. If we listened respectfully to them a bit more often, perhaps our society, perhaps Australia, would be one that truly placed care compassion and inclusion at its centre. And it's also good to look back sometimes as well as forward. It's really special to be in Canberra on the day, just the day after, those glorious statues of Dame Dorothy Tangi and Dame Enid Lyons were unveiled not far from here in the Parliamentary Triangle. Their enduring legacies as the first women to enter federal parliament in 1943 have finally been acknowledged in this appropriate way, some 80 years later. Now, half a century ago, Marie Coleman AO was appointed the first woman in Australia to head a Commonwealth Government statutory agency. I know she's watching this broadcast today, and I want to both wish her a very happy 90th birthday and send all our very best wishes for her in delivering the Pamela Danoon Lecture tonight here in Canberra. Yes. Now, Marie was the first woman to hold the powers of permanent head under the Public Service Act, and the first woman to chair Gough Whitlam's Social Welfare Commission in 1973. She was the founding secretary of the National Foundation for Australian Women and a member of the board of directors that established the Australian Women's Archives Project, one that sought to finally recognise the contribution made by women to this country. Who knew? We stand on her shoulders and the shoulders of many women like her who have been tireless advocates for gender equality and fairness for more than 60 years. They include some of the extraordinary pioneers that have inhabited our national parliament, like the late Susan Ryan AO, who Minister Katie Gallagher honoured in her oration in Susan's name just last week at the ANU. It was an important, poignant speech delivered by the Minister, and I do urge you to either watch it or read it. Minister Gallagher took us back to Australia's first women's budget in 1984, issued then by Prime Minister Bob Hawke, but really led by Susan Ryan, with input from many wonderful women, including Anne Summers, amongst others. And then she surveyed, this is the Minister talking about that time, she surveyed the ups and downs of progress for women over the course of the 40 years since, arriving at her own women's budget statement that she released with the Prime Minister and the Treasurer just in October last year. And while celebrating the significant progress that had been achieved for women as a result of the determination and focus of those pioneers, the Minister explicitly pointed out how easily the progress for women can, and often does, get wound back in Australia. Nothing can be taken for granted, which is why she rightly warned of the significant risks of rollback in the future should we fail to entrench current commitments and policies in legislation, or if we fail the test of working purposefully together as a community with warmth and trust on the structural and cultural reforms necessary to achieve lasting gender equality. Thank you, Laura. I really want to thank you and the National Press Club for inviting me back to this platform. As many of you know, and as Laura very kindly has reflected on, I was last here in November 2021, then representing Chief Executive Women. Chief Executive Women has a new president, Susan Lloyd-Hurwitz, who's just retired as the Chief Executive of Mirvac, but today she's representing Chief Executive Women at the Commission on the Status of Women in New York with the delegation on behalf of the Australian Government, again giving the data on Australia's gender equality opportunities and history to the United Nations. But back then, we were reflecting on the profound things that we had just learned as we came out of the COVID pandemic. And we were calling for care to be at the centre of our economy and for it to be regarded as essential infrastructure, no less important than all other forms of infrastructure we so readily invest in. Now, at that time and right here, we called for reform on universal, accessible early education and care, for government leadership on paid parental leave and superannuation, and for secure, well-paid jobs and careers in the care industries, including education. We called for respect at work for all, and for women to be at decision-making tables across the country at all levels and to be well represented in our parliaments, federal, state and local. Well, you will know a lot has happened since then. Immediately after my speech in 2021, the New South Wales Treasurer, Matt Keane, and his team contacted me and indicated that they wanted to quickly put economic opportunity at the heart of the New South Wales budget in 2022. He very kindly asked me to chair the New South Wales Women's Economic Opportunities Panel and to advise on the structural and budget reforms that New South Wales could pursue to lift women's workforce participation and enhance the economy. We were a very small panel appointed by the Treasurer, supported by a very enthusiastic New South Wales Treasury team and wonderful bureaucrats, and a range of ministers across the New South Wales Cabinet. At the time of its formation, I was mindful of a threshold condition raised by one of our members, Maha Abdo. She was then President of Muslim Women of Australia. And she counselled, as a member of that panel, that our work would only be successful if the experiences and voices of the full diversity of women across New South Wales were heard. The full diversity, all women. And we would have to both listen respectfully, hear what we were listening to, and then act accordingly. In making our recommendations to the government prior to their 2022 state budget, which was centred on a significant investment in universal, accessible, high-quality childcare, I believe we kept that promise to the women of New South Wales. Among many other initiatives, the budget confirmed an investment of $5 billion into the New South Wales Childcare and Opportunity Fund, a brand new fund which has now been secured and protected into the future through legislation, with an independent board appointed to oversee its operation. A further $5.8 billion investment was made in free, universal pre-kindergarten for every child in the year before starting school. When combined with the Commonwealth's contribution, New South Wales Treasury's projections are that these reforms are expected to help up to 95,000 women in New South Wales to enter or re-enter the workforce or take on more hours, and grow the New South Wales economy by up to $17 billion, a multiple of the investment. At the same time, Carol Schwartz AO, a wonderful leading Victorian woman and a good friend of mine, was conducting an inquiry into gender equality in Victoria. And in the days leading up to the federal election in May 22, the Victorian and New South Wales premiers did something quite extraordinary and crossed normal party lines and issued a joint media statement committing their respective states to an extra year of preschool. And now that we find ourselves in the middle of an election campaign in New South Wales, I think it is wonderful to see that the issue of boosting women's workforce participation and economic security is central to the policy offerings, as evidenced by a range of very significant commitments being made by all sides of politics. And of course, quite a bit more happened since late 2021. You all know, and you know it if you work here in Canberra or you're a political junkie, 10 months ago, the new Labor government under Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was sworn into office with a record 10 women being appointed to the Cabinet, meaning that nearly half the Cabinet are women, with many of them holding the most significant economic portfolios, and more than half of the caucus are women. Arguably, just as extraordinary was the political earthquake of the so-called Teal women independents in defeating sitting Liberal MPs in what were once Liberal Party strongholds. I'm delighted that so many of them are here joining us today, because together they, with so many of the new senators and members of Parliament, reflect a rapidly changing composition of the Parliament, both in terms of gender and cultural background. A lot of other things happened that weren't political in the past 18 months, not the least being the catastrophic floods that wiped out communities in northern New South Wales and in West Australia, leaving thousands traumatised and in many cases homeless and or living in totally unlivable conditions. The impact has been and is continuing to be simply devastating, particularly for families and single parents and of course children, with women once again playing essential roles in holding communities together, sacrificing their jobs, sacrificing themselves, coordinating relief activities, caring for others, caring always, and of course experiencing increasing levels of poverty that the floods and those climate impacts are exacerbating. Laura's already mentioned that there was also the Jobs and Skills Summit held here in Parliament House just up the road, where not only did women make up half the delegates, which was a first, but where economist and Grattan CEO Danielle Wood captured the scale of the economic opportunity represented by Australian women's workforce participation in her memorable quip, and I quote, "I can't help but reflect that if untapped women's workforce participation was a massive ore deposit, we would have governments lining up to give tax concessions to get it out of the ground." She's so right. By examining the underlying state of our economy, she demonstrated in her opening address about the state of the economy that we needed to address the critical roles that investments in gender equality could make, not only for Australia's prosperity and our future, but purely for our resilience, that without it, we would be brittle and fragile. Danielle is also a member of our task force, I'm delighted to say, and has brought her fine economic analysis to our work. And it makes me often reflect just how much we owe Australian women economists, particularly during recent years, where their voices have changed the way we talk about the economy and how we live within it. The Women in Economics Network, which Danielle chairs, is a wonderful example of amplifying those voices. So since coming to office, I really believe that the Albanese government has been true to its word in promoting gender equality and committing to the structural changes required to build confidence for women to be equal partners in the economic success of the country and for our own lives to be better. We've all been watching in real time the legislation that was promised making its way through the Parliament, including on paid parental leave, childcare reform, industrial relations reform, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency transparency and reporting enhancements, comprehensive respect at work legislation, industrial relations reform in the care sectors and beyond, Fair Work Commission referrals and the aged care wage case, and the inclusion of gender equality in the purpose of the Commission. This week's appointments of 3 new Fair Work Commission expert members is indicative of the progress. Professor Marion Baird AO and Dr Leonora Rees will be taking their deep experience in pay equity to bolster the considerations given by the Commission when making decisions about our future. They will take into account the drivers of the gender pay gap, which has not been a feature of the Fair Work Commission before. And just this week, I'm really proud to say we saw the passage in the Senate of the reform paid parental leave arrangements. I'm pleased that our task force was asked to was consulted on the design of the new plan, supported by rigorous analysis by the experts in the field. Again, Professor Marion Baird AO and Professor Elizabeth Hill from Sydney University. I also want to highlight that whilst I talk a lot in this speech about economics and economic policies and employment policies, I want to highlight that the policy focus and investments that are being made in supporting the national plan to reduce violence against women is a serious commitment to solving one of the most distressing, intractable problems in this country. I'm really delighted that the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian National Research Organisation on Women's Safety, Padma Raman, joins us today because she's playing a pivotal role in making those connections between violence and the poverty and financial impost that women experience. And we know far too much about those high levels of domestic and family violence. I want to come back to budgets and back to this, which is the Women's Budget Statement that was released by the government on the night of the October 22 budget. In delivering this budget, Minister Gallagher, together with the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, co-signed the budget itself, the entire commitment to women, and made the following remarks in their opening introduction. I will quote them. Gender inequality is holding Australia back. Australia was ranked 43rd of 146 countries in the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Index. Our national level indicators highlight persistent gaps between women and men, including a pay gender gap of 14.1%. That has dropped slightly since this was published. Women in Australia continue to shoulder the majority of unpaid work and caring responsibilities and are more likely to be in part-time, casual or low-paid work as they try to balance work and family. Until there is true gender equality, we cannot reach our full potential and be the Australia we want to be. That's a call to action for the future of the economy of this country. If we don't care about the rights of women, we should certainly care about the future economy, particularly when we're being told now by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer and the Minister for Women, Minister for Finance and Minister for the Australian Public Service that we cannot reach our potential as a nation unless we deal with gender equality. So the budget did try to aim and stay true to that aim and put women and gender equality at the head of many of the conversations that were had about the budget. You may not know that though, because not many journalists ask the questions about it. And I'm sorry to say that I get terribly disappointed when I think that all that richness and data sitting in the women's budget sat without question or interest from so many of the economic journalists who actually I think play a bit of gotcha on budgets as opposed to digging deep into what the Prime Minister and his senior ministry were saying about where this country could head if we did this well. So one of the commitments in the statement is, of course, the establishment of the task force that I'm very proud to chair. We were tasked with rapidly providing the government with recommendations for creating economic equality in Australia and to advise on the government's national strategy to achieve gender equality and provide feedback on gender-responsive budgeting and policy making. Only yesterday, on International Women's Day, the Minister released the Status of Women report card, the first for her and one she hopes to release every year, and invited all Australians to take part in a national consultation on how we might achieve gender equality in this country. As she indicated, despite many improvements for women, there is comprehensive evidence that in a number of areas progress is slowing or has stalled. It is clear that gender inequality is not only holding women back, as I have said, but it is now a brake on our economy and our progress as a country, should we care about that. And as we enter much more difficult economic conditions, the full utilisation of one of the most educated, energetic and capable cohorts, women, has never been more important. And we know women want that opportunity. I do encourage you to look at the report card. It holds very significant and revealing data, and a lot of it. But I thought I'd pull out just a few telling insights, I guess, to set the scene. 80% of one-person families in this country are single mothers. 80%. Single women are the majority of rent assistance recipients. A gender pay gap emerges for women in this country immediately after graduation. Young women are more likely to report experiencing sexual violence in their lifetime, and the figures in their 20s are staggering. Over 51% of Australian women will experience sexual violence in their 20s. It lessens as women get older, but it is no less staggering, the numbers that are in the data sheet. There is gender segregation and segmentation in how we work. So, here's the work that women do. 96.6% of hours worked by child carers is done by women. 86.9% of hours worked by registered nurses are done by women. 79.9% hours worked by primary school teachers are done by women. The full-time gender pay gap may now be at a record low, but women still learn less on average on every indicator. There's an almost 12% gap on the hourly earnings pay gap. There is an almost 14% gap on the full-time weekly pay, and a staggering almost 30% gap on the total annual taxable income between men and women. And here's a doozy, one that I think most women understand absolutely if they have chosen to have children and raise a family. There is a 55% drop in earnings for a mother in the 5 years following childbirth, while the man's income remains unchanged. Just think about that for a moment. Women of all ages, and I think the women in the room will know this, spend 9 hours a week more than men on unpaid work and care. Women do more unpaid housework than men even when they are the primary breadwinner. That's 5 hours extra than the men in their household. And disturbingly, women approaching retirement have over 23% less superannuation. And I think that's a generous figure. I think it's far, far worse. And 1 in 3 women will retire in this country with no retirement savings at all. Women's workforce participation has risen significantly in the past 40 years. It is one of the great stories when you look at what has happened since that 1984 budget. We are more employed, there is no doubt about that. But those gains are all reflected in part-time and insecure work. There has not been a single increase in the percentages of women's full-time participation rate over the past 4 decades. Again, something to reflect on as to how we're using some of the most brilliant, talented, highly educated women in the world. And there's plenty of compounding data which tells us even more. For example, last week, the latest Financier Women's Index was released and reveals that a slowing Australian economy in the December quarter did put the brakes on women's financial progress in 2022. So we're now seeing the impact of a slowing economy specifically on women. The CEO of Anti-Poverty Week, Tony Wren, who often speaks here, reminds us regularly that poverty in this country is highly gendered. We know that single-parent families, predominantly single-mother families, have the highest poverty rates of any family in the country. I think many of the comments in the last week in favour of the minor tweaking of the superannuation cap were couched in terms of those people who understand deeply what's going on with the growing inequality in our super system and saving system for women. Tony says the focus must be on helping those who have missed out on super, such as women leaving violence whose hardship often reaches deep into their retirement. She said aged pensioners whose rents are more than 4 times as high are likely to be living in poverty than those who own their own home. I could, of course, continue for hours sharing with you all of the data that tells you that, without question, there is a reason why this government has had to put the women's economic equality agenda at the centre of the budget and policy making. I don't think I need to make that case really any further. So, when we were established as a task force, we used our first meetings to establish the principles that would guide our advice to government. Together, we agreed that we would listen closely to the stories of women themselves, in their voices and through their experiences. As a principle, however, together with the Office for Women, we agreed that although our task force was diverse, it's a very diverse group of 13 women, with Indigenous representation by Shelley Cable and Shirlene Campbell, we could not make broad assumptions about the frameworks within which First Nations women would consider progress on gender equality. Working with the Office for Women, Professor Noreen Young from the UTS Business School convened 2 expert panels, a community business panel chaired by Kate George and an academic panel chaired by distinguished Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson. The panels have advised us that in relation to the capacity to provide avenues to address gender inequality among First Nations communities, it is imperative that that work to be designed for and by First Nations communities, and we agree. So in order to do that, within the gender equality strategy, there is now time and space to consult and develop that work in a culturally appropriate manner, and will build on the important work already undertaken by so many First Nation women leaders. The task force also agreed that in seeking the experiences of women from across the broadest spectrum of life in Australia, we would not consult, we would engage. Rather than starting with propositions, we simply wanted to listen and understand women's stories and lives, ensuring that underpinning our recommendations, getting under the numbers, would not just be statistics and things that we hear at a macro level that we all know far too well, but the experiences of women themselves, the reality of their lives and their aspirations. From the outset, we also agreed that we would put early focus on those women experiencing the greatest disadvantage and vulnerability in our country, and to look at urgent reforms and immediate budget priorities. Therese was a big part of that discussion in our first meeting, and I credit her with taking the entire group of us to a point where we agreed that this was the priority for this coming budget and for the work that we would deliver as a task force. The fact that it is a task force of 13 who could come to that agreement in its first meeting, I think underscores the fact that we all saw Australia's economic and social progress needing to be underpinned by paying respect to those women first, and to trust that their stated desire to want to be part of the economy and to work was important to listen to. Given the depth and breadth of experience from around the country, and the fact that the diversity of our task force encompasses everyone from former government ministers, Jenny Macklin, to leading economists, I've already mentioned Danielle Wood, to large business with the CEO of the Business Council of Australia, Jennifer Westacott, to the union movement, ACTU President Michelle O'Neill, to single mothers, thank you Therese Edwards, to young women working in remote environments in the north like Sizzle Farama, to leading researchers on labour markets like Professor Ray Cooper, to social service leadership from Adrian Piccoli from the Tasmanian Council of Social Services. That group of women came together and could agree quickly the priorities and focus that we could deliver despite that extraordinary array of backgrounds that we brought to this conversation. We also listened to the experiences of women with a disability through Samantha Connor and the aspirations of entrepreneurs from Chastity Anderson. Shelley Cable and Shirlene Campbell, I've already mentioned, were incredible and are incredible representatives of Indigenous communities around the country. But of course, none of us were there exclusively in that representation role. We were there as women in our own right. They are eminent Australians who are independently going to provide bold recommendations encouraged by the Minister. And of course, we understand the fiscal environment, and we were all too well aware that as we started our work, the economic settings were changing rapidly. But we were also clear that we intended to ensure that our report and recommendations would create a legacy, not a neglected, dusty report on the shelf to be cited in a decade or so about missed opportunities. We agreed to look at achievable time horizons and timeframes for reform that could be shared across government, business, community, and underpinned by a legislative program. We believe that this is sound public policy, smart policy that will unlock multiple contributions of women to Australian society, including as people, partners, parents, employees, entrepreneurs, employers and change makers, and provide them with the visibility, confidence, skills and opportunity they need to maximise their economic contribution. Most of the things that we have identified will require decades of work, and we're not shy about that, because delivering on enduring outcomes will require building on these outcomes year after year in a staged, transparent and measurable way. This should be a guiding principle of achieving gender equality generally and underpin the work of the National Gender Equality Strategy. We also felt it was important to consider what women need in Australia across 3 broad life stages. It won't surprise you the kind of questions we asked. What do women in the first third of their life need? Well, they need safety, opportunity, skills acquisition, education, gender neutral and gender affirming pathways into decent jobs and careers, parenting assistance, access to high quality early education, childcare and care, access to unbroken solid superannuation. What do women in the middle third of their lives need? Well, not to be overlooked or dismissed at work due to parenting and caring, or simply their gender. Continue investment in pathways to remain in all industries, sectors and roles. They also need the removal of the highly rigid, gendered norms about who is responsible for childcare and household management, which we know are just as harmful and limiting for men as they are for women. And what do women in the third period of their life need? Well, good pathways to dignity would be a start, to dignity in retirement, including superannuation. Options for giving back to the community that are meaningful and respected, where they can use their brains, their skills and their wisdom. Options for ageing well, both in the general community or in residential care. They need support in caring for ageing parents when these women are in their 60s. We listen to women in all of these cohorts deeply and respectfully. And I thought I'd just share with you some of their words rather than me trying to summarise. And I hope that if any of the women are listening, we're not quoting any of them. They were all unidentified, they were volunteers, and they shared very much their experience with us. And I'm going to paraphrase the things that we heard. Things like, every time I try to get ahead, I get punished by the system. When I do normal things, like going to university, getting skills or having children, it is me that suffers for years. I still have my HECS debt because I took time off work for the kids. So my debt grows while my super stalls, my career goes backwards. My husband doesn't have to deal with that. I didn't have children, that's what saved me, but I'm still precarious. Everything falls apart when my daughter turns 8. This is a single mother on payments. I'm in a completely different world from that moment. Care work, it starts from the beginning. It's always been implicit that we'll take on that load. I sometimes look at my brother and I can't believe he's gone through life without this load. I had to use my super to pay my mortgage just to save my house. It took me only 2 years to lose everything I'd built. I'm never going to be able to retire. The system doesn't and won't support me to allow that. I will be homeless. And she will, because we know that the fastest cohort of people suffering from deep poverty and homelessness in this country today is women over 55. We also heard many heartbreaking personal reflections from women who had fled marriages and relationships to escape violence, whether physical, sexual or coercively controlling. I'm not going to try to summarise those. You can imagine those conversations, the tears, the sharing, the incredible tenacity and strength of those women telling us what had happened when they chose the wrong person to have children with, and how hard it was to get out, and why they would stay for longer if they could, but they needed to protect their children. One woman said, how can you get to this point in your life when you are so reduced, no matter what the contribution is you're making, no matter what you give? It is just so unjust. I hope if any of the women watching today who have been part of this know that we hear and we see you. We want you in the centre of policy, not in a statistic. And I'd like people watching the broadcast and those here today, when you leave, maybe what you all need to do when you think about gender equality and fixing these gaps, move beyond the numbers that you control or you're interested in and ask the very same questions and just simply listen to the voices of women. I don't know about you, but every time I get together with family, friends, colleagues, If it's a group of women, the conversation goes in this direction, and we should trust it and understand that it underpins the very nature of the gender equality that we are all seeking. We also asked women what their lives are like generally, and they told us. We also asked them what they want, and they told us that too. And their reflections are probably best captured by Ray Cooper. And Professor Ray Cooper is a member of our panel, and of course a distinguished professor at Sydney University. And she says this: women come into the labour market post-education and experience the architecture of difference and discrimination, the glass ceiling, where they are shut out of senior and strategic roles, the glass walls, where they are chronically underrepresented in the most lucrative of sectors and instead corralled into undervalued work, and the sticky floors, where they dominate in some of the lowest paid and most precarious job with poor career paths and little progression. At the same time, they shoulder double the unpaid work and are on the receiving end of unacceptable levels of disrespect and harassment. No wonder they are annoyed. And we are annoyed. I think we all feel that. I'm going to share with you now just a few highlights of the recommendations that we plan to make to government. I'm conscious that we've only given this information in depth to the Minister herself, and she gave me permission just to give you a sense of the highlights of it, which I'm happy to do, but I won't spend much time on it because we're in the process of building the document itself and the report that we'll share with you once we've delivered that to government. But here's what we want to do. We want to absolutely back in the commitment to a universal, high-quality early education and care system. We want more and more unpaid parental leave. We've been delighted with the increases in PPL to date, but we want superannuation on paid parental leave. We also want those women with the most entrenched disadvantage right now to receive our attention, as I've already mentioned, and I can tell you that one of our primary recommendations will be for the restoration of the single-parent payment for women with children over 8 years old. We want to have increased the Commonwealth rental assistance. We want to see mutual obligations a thing of the past and start respecting women who are on payment systems. We want to allocate funding for an upfront and immediate pay rise for all early childhood educators in recognition of their historical undervaluation of their work and the urgent need to retain and attract workers to that sector. If we're going to put our most precious children into the hands of that workforce, we want that workforce to be well paid and not looking around and wondering what on earth they are doing when they can earn better money almost everywhere else. We want to constructively support Action and Fair Work Commission equal remuneration and work value applications to raise the wages of conditions of workers right across the care economy, as has been the case with the aged care case. We also want the activity test abolished as part of the childcare subsidy. You will have seen Angela Jackson's extraordinary economic analysis that has shown that there's over $8 billion, a prize of $8 billion to the Australian economy annually if we abolish the activity test. Once again, a woman economist able to get beneath those numbers to make sure we understand exactly what it is that paid parental leave and good childcare can do to this country. We have a lot of other things to talk about. We don't like the way the Parents Next program runs today. We would like to see that abolished and to be reimagined and reinvestment go into a new program of the kind that Jenny Macklin created when it was first established, which is actually about encouraging and working with young mothers, particularly young teenage mothers, to get them back connected to school and the workforce, but not punish them and have a sword of Damocles hanging over their head based on a pernicious system that has actually punished those young women and young families to date. We want a lot of things, and we've got to have it costed, and we'll put our full suite of recommendations to the government shortly. We think there's a huge role for the machinery of government, the normalising of gender-responsive budgeting across all budget measures and policies. We want the APS to be the greatest employer and set the record straight about what does it look like to be an employer, one of the biggest employers in the country that actually believes in gender equality and sees women respectfully treated across all parts of the public service. And of course, as a procurer, as a regulator, and as a funder, the Commonwealth, together with the states, can do enormous lifting, which we will also talk to. So I'm going to try and wind things up now, because I've given you a sense of our passion as a task force when it comes to the things we think should happen in the budget that we are about to face into and for which ERC meetings are already underway. But we also want to be part of that broader communication that's going on that will see that a gender equality strategy means something for all of us and doesn't divide the nation. Just last week, the Prime Minister spoke of both the urgency and consequence of this decade. a moment in our national history where we have choices to make as to how we ensure that Australia is viable and competitive and safe and on the world stage where we have been in the past. I totally agree with him. This is a hugely consequential decade. There's climate change, there's security, there's a changing socio-economic and a huge dynamic across the world and around the region. We've got instability everywhere. But you very rarely hear, when we talk about this hugely consequential decade, the role of gender equality and the role of women. And I would say I'd love it if the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, senior members of the press gallery started to ask the question about how consequential will it be to ensure that women's equality is discussed in important meetings. In fact, I had the opportunity to go to an APEC meeting in the US 2 weeks ago and met the senior advisor to President Biden on gender equality. She's also worked for President Obama and for Hillary Clinton previously. And she pointed out that over the last 2 years, one of the most important and significant commitments that President Biden has made is to gender equality as a key piece of infrastructure for the US economy. I hope the Prime Minister and the President get a chance to have a chat about that in addition to AUKUS and other things, because it will matter to them and it will matter for us to hear that that's what they're now talking about. Now, if you'll indulge me, I was told that I could speak for just slightly bit longer today, given the different nature of today. And I just wanted to say something and share something with you about just how we are going to approach this period of time where, as a nation, we try to understand how we're going to be respectful with each other when we talk about gender equality. I was going to share some stories about how it didn't seem too hard to break the gender norms of sport with the rise of AFLW in football. Against all odds, 20 years ago, it would have been one of the strictest gendered norms that no woman was going to play as a professional footballer in this country, and nor should she. Today, one of the most important aspects of football in this country and across the sports, the previous men's codes, is the presence of women at the highest levels, actually driving the revenue and the economies of those sports in ways that, if it had not been done, we would have had lost opportunities. I can say the same thing about the extraordinary women's cricket side that not only continues to win and show the men that there is a way to win at cricket, but have also become mainstays of the recently launched Indian Premier League, the Women's Premier League, the WPL, probably one of the richest in prize money of any kind of sport in the world, underpinned by great cricketing women like Meg Lanning. If we can break norms around women in sport, surely we can break norms about women in industry and in our workplaces. And I want to turn to the arts, because I don't think we should ever talk about sport without talking about the arts. I'd like to acknowledge that Nick Mitsevich is here, the director of the National Gallery of Australia. I'm really delighted that he's come along today. And if you think about what's changing in the arts and what it takes for leaders to change how we think about things, it was Nick that, when he arrived at the National Gallery, realised that we don't get to look at women's art. We get to look at a lot of men's art. A lot of women's art is in the vault. So what did he do? He not only created a gender equality strategy for the gallery, which he promoted all over the place, but he also left us with and gave us all the opportunity to go to those magnificent Know My Name exhibitions, so that we would actually see and engage with and celebrate women as artists of our history, just as we have with men. He didn't stop there. He then was able to bring out a blockbuster here in Canberra with the Cressida Campbell exhibition, just closed. Probably one of the most successful exhibitions in the gallery's history, certainly the most successful book of the gallery's history, and now one of the most successful artists, man or woman, is Cressida Campbell, because someone decided that there was a gender inequality in the way we think about art. So we can do this in sport and art, and we have got a chance to do it everywhere. So, what is courage? I put courage in the title of my speech today very purposefully. Do we have the courage to do this? Well, courage is the strength in the face of fear or adversity or pain. It's the ability to do the things that frighten us or upset us, or at least make us apprehensive. And it's a word that means we do these things from the heart as much from the head, not just for ourselves, but for others and on behalf of others. What we now require as a nation is the courage to recognise that gender equality is not a zero-sum game. It is not an equation whereby if women gain, men somehow lose. That simply is not the case. It's an equation where, as I have said here before, all ships get lifted by that same tide. Now, we all know there are some men who are angry and very angry. They're angry at social and economic forces shifting under their feet, and who can blame them? Really. Some of them are angry at women because they feel displaced or marginalised or scared. Many of them are scared. and because they feel they've borne the weight of the world on their backs for far too long and they can't take it anymore. Their whole sense of themselves is as providers, as heads of their families, and that's under threat. So they lash out, whether at home or online, and they listen to other angry men who reinforce their views that women have achieved too much agency in their personal lives or too many gains in their professional lives, and that this agency and these gains should be rolled back. Now, we know there's a growing legion of these men all over the world, but we also know that for all these disaffected men, there are others hoping to be part of the solution. I work with so many of these men. They're members of my family and my friendship groups. They are making their mark. They are showing that we can do this. One of them, David Laser, wrote a book in 2019 called Women, Men and the Whole Damn Thing, about the historical origins of patriarchy and misogyny, and he wrote it not to tell women what to think or do, but to urge other men to become better allies to the women in their lives. I'm going to share an anecdote he has in the book. It includes an interview that a Canadian journalist, Liz Plank, had when she was visiting Iceland to find the most reconstructed men on the planet and to find out what had happened to lead to a country where it's now illegal to pay women less than men. So she spoke to these Icelandic men and she said, "So, you all want to smash the patriarchy?" And they were sitting on this frozen clearing outside Reykjavik. "Yes," said the first man. "Is it totally normal for men to be feminists?" Plank asked. "It is now," the second man said. "It wasn't. It was a negative, but now, if you're not a feminist, you're in the Stone Age." Then the third man said, "I have no idea how I became a feminist. I have no idea where the ideas come from, but I suppose it's just a matter of being decent." "So, what's your advice to men?" Plank asked. "Don't be afraid to listen," the fourth man said. "Embrace it because it benefits everyone," said the first man. "If you're not having half the population take part in society," said the fifth man, "society will not grow as fast as you would like. Gender equality should be as normal as drinking water." As normal as drinking water. Well, wouldn't that be nice? And wouldn't that be wonderful here in Australia? Well, it's the growing number of men, including Hunter Johnson from the Man Cave, together with his team of facilitators who are doing exactly this work here and been doing it for the past decade, helping tens of thousands of boys and young men give fuller expression to their humanity, while also challenging some of the outdated scripts of masculinity. There's Professor Michael Flood from the Queensland University of Technology, who's been leading efforts in Australia and internationally to engage men in ending domestic and sexual violence while building gender equality. And there's my friend and colleague on the board of ANROS, Ed Mosby, a psychologist and founder of Wokaiwayan Healing from the Torres Strait. Ed has been active in sharing understandings around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander violence and anger, publishing and sharing his work through workshops and engagements right across his communities. He has some of the deepest experience in the design and facilitation of behavioural change programs, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men, particularly perpetrators of family and domestic violence. And he regularly enhances the work of ANROS with his insights. So these men are part of a growing network of individuals and organisations in this country dedicated to fostering healthier and more flexible ideas of what it means to be a man, whilst also demonstrating that gender equality is in the interests of us all. In essence, helping to unwind the constricting norms that often restrict men as much as releasing women. And I understand that group of men are moving to create a network and start collaborating and working together, and I'm sure they'll be an important part of the discussions on the National Gender Equality Strategy. So, if we care to look, and I think we should, there are men everywhere wanting to try to be part of this, but this is now for us. We've actually got to show the bravery and the courage. And I wonder, if I just asked of all you, do you care? What do you care about? What are you prepared to do personally and in your leadership roles to make sure that we don't blow this incredible opportunity in this most incredible decade to make sure that women's equality, gender equality, benefits us all? Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Sam. I'll just indulge presidential licence for a moment to just ask you a very non-specific question, which is very hard to answer, but it just struck me when you were talking that, as you say, we've got an unprecedented number of women in the workforce, yet we've got this really weird thing going on where, despite that, we've got rising anger amongst men, but also rising, it almost feels like rising inequality, but certainly a greater cohort of women in poverty. And a lot of that's to do with government policies particularly. But how do you explain that, the fact that everybody's worried about superannuation, which mainly affects men, and they're not worried about the fact that there are so many women now living in poverty in different stages of their lives, and as a result, children. Now, you know, it's the media's fault. You know, I blame the media always, but you know, what is the dysfunction here in our national conversation?
Well, I mean, I hate to jump to that, but in part, the reason I called out the fact that we never hear these questions asked of our leaders. We very rarely have a whole lot of men coming along to talks like this. The questions get to be divisive and gotcha, as they all were around the superannuation changes. You know, when you've got leaders and treasurers and people in bureaucracies trying to find ways to say, how do we deal with this constructively to make to deal with inequality, and actually put up ideas that are sensible, they are affordable, and they make a huge difference, and they start to tell us about where real need is. When you can't have that conversation in this country without having to then pass through an ideological sort of booby-trapped conversation with I guess the community just turning off and saying, there they go again. And I think what has happened is, because we've not given ourselves the permission and trust to have these conversations and let ideas flow. We saw it happen with the Treasurer's essay. We've heard wellbeing budgets described as kind of karmic and, you know, have nothing to do with the economy. And yet the rest of the world knows that these post-GDP models are the pathway to a successful economy. So I think part of it's the media, part of it's not trusting ourselves to be able to have these conversations. And you know, I learnt from Therese, when you actually sit and listen to the people who are most affected by the terrible impacts of bad policy, and you actually interpret what they're saying and then ask, what do you want to do? And they tell you, I want to get back to work, I want to become a taxpayer, I want to be a great parent, but this whole system keeps me in this pernicious situation where I can't do any of those things, so I will just be a constant draw on the public purse. They know the answers, but we don't trust that back into the policy world.
But they're not regarded as, they haven't been regarded as part of the economic solution, if you like. They haven't been regarded as something that is an economic good, as you've said in your speech. They've been regarded as a drag on.
And there it is.
Budget.
And I mean, you've got to wonder, watching the Royal Commission into robo-debt, those things start with a view about the people receiving the payments. They must. And I'm not putting that against any government or any particular people. It is, if you think you can't trust people who are in poverty and they're going to rip off the system, be dole bludgers, then you design a system ready to catch them and to punish them. And that's so much of our welfare system. And so Anne Summers talks a lot about this, that we've got to stop thinking of single mothers as welfare recipients. We think of single mothers as mothers. And we heard a couple of stories from women who spoke to us through Theresa's organisation, who said, you've got to know what it feels like when I'm about to celebrate the 8th birthday of my youngest child, and the birthday happens, and the next day my self-conception and the conception of the government about who I am has gone from being a mother or a parent to being on welfare. And it happens as soon as that child turns 8. And it's the same in so much other parts of the welfare system, that we tell that community, now you are now a drain on us, we don't trust you, we're going to punish you. When we talk to those women and men, all they say is, give me a chance to better myself, make the system flexible enough so that I can get back into work, get my skills. I hate saying they. These are communities of people who want to be part of the economic success of this country, are championing it a bit. And if we don't do something about that, not only will there be a drag, but those wonderful Australians are just being kept out of the labour force. And we know they want to do it, and we know that we know in huge numbers how productive they will be if treated that way.
We're going to have to race through the questions this afternoon. Steph Boris from the ABC.
Thank you. Steffi Boris from the ABC. Thank you, Sam, for your speech. You said one of the recommendations to government will be abolishing the activity test. We've heard a number of reports saying it's not good policy. So just a couple of questions on that. Your view of why it's bad policy. Have you done the numbers on the cost of abolishing it versus the benefits to the economy? And in an ideal world, when would you like to see it abolished by?
Well, there's a lot in that question. So the first thing I'd say is just read Angela's report that was released on Monday that does somewhat of the modelling, but certainly does all of the modelling of the upside of the $8 billion that's available to us if we could abolish that test and ensure that women, as they're getting back into work, don't have to. They're in this incredible chicken and egg cycle. So you want to go back to work quite quickly after you've had your child. You have an attachment to the firm, maybe through paid parental leave, but you haven't got your childcare sorted. You don't know quite where you're going in your career, but you've got to prove under the activity test a certain number of things before you can go and get the childcare sorted. If you can't do that, then you've got to pay for that childcare before you're back in work. So what's happening with those families is either the woman says, it's too hard, I can't go back, so she doesn't return to work, or that family starts paying for childcare that they could have got under the subsidy if the activity test hadn't been the block as she's preparing, she or he, preparing to go back into the work and be very productive. And so Angela's work just shows that value that sits in all of that activity around the household is an economic cost. And once we take away those things that hold that family back from making the smart decision, then the economic benefit is extraordinary. And she did the same modelling on the benefit of childcare itself, and then looking at the activity test as the next phase. I mean, we would say we're pragmatic, but we know this is a very, very tough budget. I mean, I think the Minister is having to handle an enormous amount of pressure because she's also Minister for Finance. So we're not going to be silly about it, but I think all the evidence is there to actually start the pathway to see how that activity test could be removed in a way that fits with the rest of the budget. But as I said, these are decadal changes we've got to make. We want the ones up front that deal with the most disadvantaged women to start, but the activity test is up there as well.
So within the next year? 2 years?
I think I can't speak. The budget is well underway for this one. I would say that what all of this says that we're asking a government in this term to start giving us a roadmap about when. Actually give certainty. If it can't be done this one, well, when? Is it 2 years' time? Is it going to be taken to the next election for a government that wins to say that will be our first priority as we go in? Get the community's attention on this, tell that story and make it part of your commitment to those that want to vote for you. Because I think we haven't spoken about voters, but women are onto this. The Newgate report on the mood of the nation is worth having a look at, the last series a couple of weeks ago, which shows that women are deeply concerned about the future of the economy, men not so much. Women are worried very much about all these social issues and payments, men not so much. And there's something going on literally in there about who we're talking to about these issues, so worth having a look at that too, I think.
Amanda Cobb. We've only got a few more minutes, unfortunately, so maybe we could just keep the answers a little succinct.
Amanda Kopp from the Community Radio Network. We're here in Canberra today, and you have spoken about the current equality in Parliament at the moment. There are a lot more women in our government ranks, but we have also talked about how quickly that can go backwards. Do you think that the coalition should be introducing quotas?
Oh, goodness. I'll be very brief on this. I won't give advice to the coalition. I'll just use my experience. Every time in any job I've been in any sector that has had quotas, great women get to play where they should have always been available to be able to play, to be a part of whatever organisation. And sometimes the only way you get there is quotas. And we have to have that conversation without going straight to this ridiculous issue, and I've faced it my entire career, about that being about lack of merit. So if people could relax about it, quotas has got nothing to do with merit. It's all about getting the best talent into your organisation. So I'll leave that for the opposition to think about.
Thank you.
James Elton.
Thank you very much for your speech. The phasing out of the single parenting payment for single parents with a child over 8
yes.
That you referenced, that began, I guess, under John Howard, but was finished by the Gillard government in 2013.
Yep.
Many of the people who were in cabinet at that time in 2013 are still there, and it was politically contentious at the time and divisive within the cabinet. Do you think that the politics have shifted since then, and do you think that the people who are now in the ERC will be thinking about the politics of that decision differently?
I don't think I can give you any comment on the politics of that time or the politics of now. All I can give you is this is a piece of reform that is the smartest, most appropriate thing to do right now for this country and for those people who are just so perniciously trapped in falling into poverty. And that's not just those mothers, it's also their children. And I think if politics was at play, that's a shame. I would just say we've got to look above that. The reason we were appointed was to make independent, bold, direct advice about the best policy reforms, and that's what we've said. And I just hope that good policy and good advocacy with independence with good modelling that sits behind it is enough to say you shouldn't have to worry about whatever other commentary there is. And I'd say the media can help with that by not going back to that story and saying, what does it mean for Australia's economy today, single parents today, children today? That's why we're doing it. We can have a debate over a beer about what happened back then or happens politically. This is the best policy advice we think we're giving the government for this next budget that does the most heavy lifting for the most needy.
Our final question is from Nick Stewart.
Women have achieved so much, there's so much further to go. At what point do we say we actually need a Minister for People that will incorporate First Nations disability people, people with disability, immigrants, other people like that, so that we can look at this as a holistic problem rather than simply focus on the vitally important need of women?
So I'd say if we start with the vitally important place of women, we're over half the population and we're often treated as a minority. So if we can get this pathway right, that we're treated as equals and we're at the table with policy, we can do an even better job for every other part of the community. As I said in my speech, I hate us thinking about this as men versus women, and I'm always asked about when Men's Day is. I think Men's Day was Labor Day when the Labor reforms were made that actually gave men the wage. So I think we've got all sorts of things we could celebrate how well men did over a long period of time. We've got to put those tropes behind us. I think the Prime Minister should be the Minister for all people. I think every Minister in the Cabinet, I think every Member of Parliament should be representing all people and have the strength of their conviction and their character to be able to talk about these things without us descending into the spaces that we often go to have a fight. So it's all for the taking, I think, Nick.
Please thank Sam Mostyn for her speech today.
Sorry, it's been so long.